Chapter 11. Lines of dwarves formed before the burning building, passing buckets of water hand over hand to their neighbour. The tossed contents of each was but a dewdrop on a campfire as the flames burned hot enough to push the crowd back, the delicate skin on their faces reddening and threatening to blister. Frantic members of the crowd shouted that others could still be trapped inside, and volunteers were quickly called for. Stepping forward, each one was quickly dressed in additional layers of donated clothing. Eye holes were cut in sacks pulled over their heads before water was poured onto them until they were soaked to the skin. Tightly gripping shovels, laden down under the burden of their impromptu protection, they took deep breaths and strode into the inferno to look for their friends. It had been many years since the people of Fenoir had to fight a fire of any significance, and their knowledge was dangerously limited and based on gut instinct. Within moments of entering the burning building, the heat was so intense, the water from the outer layers of their clothing had evaporated. The moisture trapped deeper within the layers of fabric sediment began to boil and turn to steam. Unable to escape, the heat rapidly rose. Sharp, searing pain raced across their skin, causing them to throw down their shovels as they turned on their heels and raced outside to throw themselves onto the ground. Members of the crowd stepped forward to peel away the layers before sharply pulling their hands away, blowing on their singed fingertips. Buckets of water were poured onto them as everyone assembled was amazed to see the steam rising off them. The cooling layers were cut away to reveal dwarves inside whose skin had been scalded bright pink to the point of a severe sunburn that would leave them wincing for weeks to come. Doors and windows yawed open like the maws of terrible demons of the abyss to present nightmare vistas of the roaring infernos within. Smoke billowed thick and black into the sky before dispersing into a heavy grey cloud that threatened to blot out the sky and choke the lungs. Embers leapt away from the building to dance along in the wind, sizzling zephyrs drifting away to land onto nearby rooftops and be sucked under eaves on air currents as the barracks burned, the wood blackening and cracking until it could no longer hold its own weight and began to crumple in on itself. The smell of cinders followed Hitch and Cielo on the wind as they fled the village, unaware if anyone was following them or even if they were still alive. Fortunately, the mules were well fed and rested, able to keep up a steady pace throughout the day. They wanted to put as many miles as they could between them and their potential pursuers before bedding down for the night. During their first stop, while Cielo tended to the mules, Hitch had gone through the caravan and found all of their possessions and wares had been put back into the various compartments. Greed and dwarven efficiency had worked in their favour. While Hitch and Cielo had laid in the cells, the authorities had already entered into an agreement where the confiscated goods would be shipped back west, where their travellers had come from, and sold at market, the proceeds to be divided up. Thus had many a purveyor of fine goods found themselves parted from their wares to slave in the mines to further line the city council's pockets. Thanks be to you, Rear Ox, it is all still here. Hitch closed his eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. The thought of being parted from the weapons and armour he had strived so hard to create, too much to take. While Cielo had been busy looking over her shoulder to see if they were being pursued, Hitch had kept his eyes on the road ahead, longing to check the compartments, but knowing they could not afford to stop right away. Quickly arming themselves, they mounted up and started up again down the track. You know, trips to market are not usually this exciting. Hitch tried to make light of their conversation. Cielo kept a firm grip on her crossbow while scanning around. We seem to keep running from one disaster to another. I am sorry to have put you through this, young one. Cielo turned to meet his gaze. Her eyes were starting to fill with tears, but she still managed to bring up the corners of her mouth in a half-hearted smile. She snuggled in close, baring her head, and let herself cry, the stress and fear pouring from her. The sun shone warmly as they made their way through the winding valley. The forest opened up on one side, and they could see huge fields sweeping down and away, blankets of grass and grain waving in the breeze, an undulating ocean with as many blades of grass as there were stars in the night sky. They drank in the fresh, clear air and relished the simple joy of just being alive. We'll need to make camp, and soon, Hitch commented as he scanned around for places to pull off the track. The open fields to one side offered nowhere to hide. Their wheel ruts would be a dead giveaway, and there were no trees to conceal the caravan and mules behind. "I don't want to stop." Cielo looked at Hitch very seriously, her tone stern. "We might not have an option. The mules are ready to drop." The flanks of their faithful mounts were drenched in sweat, their heads drooping low as they trudged along. Scanning the other side of the track did not present a much better option either. No caves dotted the rocky slopes to offer protection from the elements, and even freshly rested, the mules would not have had the strength to drag the caravan up the incline. "Which side will we stop on?" Cielo asked nervously as she looked back over her shoulder. Hitch paused for a moment before announcing, "Both." The mules practically collapsed after being led over to a grassy field and unhitched from their harnesses. They sucked down water from the bowl offered to them before flopping down on the ground to catch their breath. Cielo fed them some of her dried fruits to lift their spirits and give them some much-needed energy. After they were taken care of, Cielo and Hitch headed over to the other side of the track. Digging their heels into the dark grey soil, they clambered up higher and higher until they had found a small plateau to make their camp. They gathered stones and stacked them into a small wall, facing the track they could hide behind. The stones would double as ammunition if they needed to hurl them down into any oncoming attackers. The sun was setting fast behind a mountain chain as they laid out their bedrolls and ate the dry rations they had purchased in the dwarven village. "They won't come for us," Hitch tried to reassure Cielo. "Even if they tried, they are on foot, and dwarves are terrible at chasing after things." He mimed a waddling run that didn't draw any laughter or even a smile. "Tomorrow we'll be through the pass and leave this all behind us. You bed down now, and I'll keep watch." She stretched out on her bedroll and was soon asleep. She slept fitfully throughout the night, waking with a start before trying to drift back off again. Each time she looked, she could see Hitch laying on his stomach, looking down his crossbow at the track below. If anyone had tried to follow them, he would pick them off before they had a chance to even react. The truth was that Hitch had fallen asleep soon after Cielo had. He was confident that even if someone had come across them, he would be roused by the sound of them going through the caravan and disturbing the mules. He was badly in need of rest himself and did not know what the following day would bring them. He would need to be alert and ready to react at a moment's notice. The stars travelled across the night sky, the moons rising and falling in turn. An owl watched on, a silent sentinel staring with saucer-like eyes from the high branch of a tree, until they had caught sight of a field mouse and quietly closed in for the kill. They dropped from the branch as a stone before opening their wings wide, holding them in place as they silently sailed along. The ears of the mouse twitched for a moment, flicking in one direction and then the other, unable to detect the raptor rapidly approaching. The owl's eyes never left their mark until the final moment. Talons slipped through fur and skin, the silence broken by the beating of wings, lifting the predator high up into the air to alight upon its perch again. The world continued to turn as life played out its course all around the slumbering pair, regardless of whether or not they might notice, or even be able to see it. They were up and away before the rising sun, rubbing sleep from their eyes, grateful that all they had to do was sit there while the mules followed the path. As the songbirds sang, they chewed on their dried rations without any energy, sipping from their water skins and wishing it was piping hot tar bean tea. The fields disappeared as the terrain grew steeper on either side, looming over them like giants while the path seemed to narrow. They followed its winding course until they crested a small rise, to be greeted by a panoramic vista that stretched out before them. They stared in amazement as they could see from horizon to horizon, the rolling green pastures and grasslands a patchwork of interlocking squares. It seemed to go on forever. The faint purple peaks of a mountain range could be spotted far in the distance beyond the rolling plains. The path they rolled along widened, their eyes following it toward a distant town. They breathed a sigh of relief, certain now that the worst of their journey was behind them. Cielo wrapped an arm around Hitch's shoulders, squeezing her tight against him. "Do you know where we are?" Cielo asked, filled with excitement at the prospect of the town in the distance. "I'm sure we'll find someone along the way that can tell us." They did not have to wait long before they came across a shepherd moving their herd over the track onto an untouched pasture. Dressed in simple pants and tunic of a heavy, sturdy material, topped with a vest that appeared to be lined with wool that matched the colour of their flock. The man stopped to observe these newcomers without saying a word. Ciela was the first to break the silence, piping up cheerfully before flashing one of her winning smiles. The dour demeanour of the shepherd changed in an instant. They were only too happy to inform them that off in the distance was the town of Pinehurst. "There is everything there that a traveller might need on their way through," the shepherd had begun. "From a stable where your mules can be looked at, to the inns where you can purchase a meal or a room with a bath." He let the last word hang out there, looking the pair up and down a final time, before waving goodbye as they trudged off after their flock. As they neared the town of Pinehurst, the dirt path began to widen, the wagon wheel ruts levelling out until they were back on cobblestones again. The paved path seemed to shrink every year as poor weather eroded away the cobblestones until they came loose and were kicked off into the long grass to be forgotten about or taken away by industrious local farmers to build projects on their properties. Every year, without fail, the city planners would argue, their budgeted funds never seeming to be enough to do anything to tackle the problem, while their festivals were never short on casks of ale and plump animals for the spit. The buildings were made of brick, overlaid with plaster, yellowed and cracking, the windows filled with simple panes of glass, and the doors planks of wood with cast iron brackets. The roofs were pitched at a more moderate angle than those of the dwarven village back in the mountains, overlapping wooden slats nailed down. Every house was assured of having at least one spot in the roof that let the rain in, the head of the household exclaiming they would do something about it as soon as the weather cleared again. No walls surrounded the village. Not a single stone was placed upon another or a wooden palisade to speak of to hold back a raiding party. It was entirely possible the good people of Pinehurst never had need to worry about such things. "Smell those cooking fires." Hitch breathed in deeply, sucking in the wondrous aromas of frying meat and eggs on the wind as the people of the town awoke and set to their wood-fired stoves to prepare hearty meals for the day ahead. Cielo joined in too, and soon they both realized how hungry they were as their bellies set to rumbling in protest. "Smells amazing," Cielo declared as she stood up in her seat, throwing her arms up in the air in excitement as she began to sing an old song that Hitch had taught her when he would make her breakfast. "I want sizzling sausage and pancakes with syrup, so stoke up your fires or you'll taste my stirrups." She rocked for a moment and nearly lost her balance before Hitch grabbed her by the wrist and pulled her back down into her seat. "Come now, girl, you'll scare these people to death roaring in here like an invading army. Now sit down before you hurt yourself." Crossing her arms, she scowled in protest at this dampening of her good mood, while the mules marched on toward the town of Pinehurst.